welcome back to Run the Terra, episode 16. I am Grandmaster Dan.
I'm Adam Edelman Munoz.
And I'm Stan Jarzewski.
Today we got a little something special for you. We'll be doing our regular meta pulse, like usual, but today we wanted to get into some debate squad. You know, we've all three of us were on our debate teams in high school, college, and our jobs. We all have extensive debate skills, if you couldn't tell. And we thought, why not bring it to the Runeterra world? Please don't look that up. You can't trust anything I say on this.
As much as Dan likes to mock, I actually did try debate in high school, and I found the rules were stifling.
Wow, that's a very cool thing to say on a very cool podcast.
It sounds like we're going to have to use debate rules to decide if the debate rules were in fact stifling.
I'm going to be reeling from what you just said for like the next probably 5 minutes. So if you could just get to the meta pulse, Stan.
That's the most formal way I can say I'm an argumentative asshole.
Stan, if you could just get to the meta pulse while I just like laugh for the next couple minutes, that'd be great.
I'm going to go ahead and just knock that out. So we have had a little bit of changes in the meta this week, which is, pretty good. Nothing too out of the ordinary, though. Burn aggro's gotten just a little bit better. I think just the list's kind of refined out. Same thing with Bannerman decks starting to run Vi at this point. And that's, I think, just really, refining that list out, solidifying where it's going to be in the meta, and then everything's kind of fallen into place now. I think the tier 1s have narrowed in a little bit now that the decks have refined their ways into just being, streamlined as they can be, and I think this is when we're starting to see, if anything needs to actually get nerfed. Burn being on top is a little scary, but I still think that it's a manageable deck. I don't really think anything is in too much danger of screwing over the meta as a whole. I've definitely seen some complaints about Burn aggro, though. People are starting to worry about it, but that's probably the only place we'll see some sort of nerf, but I really don't know what in here needs to be hit too hard. As a matter of fact, I really don't know.
I was going to say that if anything has changed, it's the kind of meteoric rise of Lux Karma, right? That deck was existing before and was good last week, but it's now, I'd say, solidly one of the more common decks I see on ladder.
Okay.
And it's it's strong, it's effective. People have kind of figured out how to make that package work.
Yeah. And that's another thing, too, is I think Lux always takes a little bit of time to kind of ramp up back into the meta. That's what she did the first time around, too. Even after buff, it took a while before she...
Go ahead.
Oh, it took a while even last time before she really landed her spot. And same thing again here. She is a powerful card. It's just we need to find the right shell for it at every given time.
Yeah, in general, this can be true with control cards, especially grindier control cards, right? Karina control tends to win, not always in one turn, but it tends to win with a fairly compact, fairly definitive end game. Ledros Atrocity, Karina your board twice, something like that.
Right.
Lux Karma you need to grind out, which means you need to be really sure you can beat everything in the meta before you can play. You don't have that opportunity to try to race to a finish.
Yeah, I very much see that with a deck like this, because it almost looks like a mid-range deck on first glance, and that's where a lot of these decks like this I feel like land is that they can be played control-y and played mid-range, and that's really where a lot of their strength comes, is from that flexibility.
Yeah.
But yeah, not too much has changed in the meta, and we're in a pretty stable spot other than that. Which I enjoy. Again,
that's good that you say. Interesting that you say stable, Stan, because I think that's part of the question that we're going to have, maybe right even now, about the meta, in particular, our debate. So I'll actually be moderating this first question now, or I guess the first statement. So it is the meta. And by meta, we're referring to the quote-unquote ladder meta, is healthy, / nerfs are effective, right? So we're going to have Stan for and Adam against. I don't want to see any cat scratching. I don't want to see any low blows unless they're funny. But let's go ahead and let Adam start out with the against, even though I think that's usually how it usually goes.
We don't want these rules stifling him, you know?
This is a question about stability, so it's
Nice.
so the
Point
burden
to
is going to
Stan.
be on me to prove my point. So it's my job to tell you that this meta sucks, and I really don't think it's hard to say that. I mean, just for starters, a single deck, the first deck everyone tried to put together the moment the expansion was announced, the Burn Aggro deck, has just been sitting on top of the meta for weeks. I mean, yeah, we can talk about all the stuff that changes under it, but fundamentally, if you're trying to play the game, the best thing to do is burn aggro. And we talked about, and we've seen this before. There was a single best deck before, and it was Kinku Elusives. And guess what? That deck got nerfed. That deck was a problem. That deck dominated metagames until it took 4 nerfs to get it fixed.
That sounds about right, yeah.
Which
Yeah.
deck was this? I'm sorry.
Kinku Elusives of Phase Pass.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was not only that, but I would argue honestly, like, yeah, actually, yeah, it was like 4. It was like 4 nerfs. Yeah.
Burn
4
aggro
patches.
is the new Kinku Elusives. And even if burn aggro wasn't a fundamental driver of the metagame, we'd still have, guess what, another top tier deck that we've seen for a long time sitting at the top, and it's Bannerman. Oh yes, you added 3 Vi. Your deck is so different now. Fundamentally, this deck has also not changed for a long time and has also been kind of sitting on top of the metagame, right? These 2 decks have made every other deck a bad choice, or at least every other deck forced to try to contend with both of these decks. That's stagnant. That's not changing. That's not adapting, and that's not an interesting set of metagames to kind of stare at over and over again.
All right.
So that's a bad metagame. Stan,
We're
your
gonna.
go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's actually my job to say Stan, your go. Stan, your go.
I completely disagree with that. I think that while there are 2 decks that are
Stan wins. That's it. No, I was kidding.
yeah, nice.
Just kidding.
Even though the decks are easy to build, they're pretty straightforward answers to the metagame. They're not so difficult that decks are going out of their way to beat them necessarily. Everyone has tools for dealing with burn aggro, be it life gain or ways to kind of wipe the board. The addition of Bilgewater did give us a lot of tools for keeping the board cleared, making life gain spells better, and in general just ways to keep burn aggro from completely knocking you out of the game. Things like Karina Control were just naturally running their life gain, and love it now that burn aggro is a big thing. Your sea monsters list and stuff like that, we're still going to run life gain since it's attached to some of the best wide removal in the game already. A lot of your mid-range decks are still doing just fine going over the top of burn aggro, and it's keeping things in a really good place where things can kind of rotate around what's good. And on top of that, like, a lot of the decks, even that aren't tier 1, have good matchups against, at the very least, burn aggro. And there are plenty of control decks that just dominate Bannerman. So I feel like we've hit a very proper triangle of representing a balanced meta that, as of right now, the aggro decks somewhat lose to the mid-range decks, the mid-range decks lose to the control decks, and everything is kind of where it should be in a natural card game. And nothing is so far out there that, like, burn aggro just beats everything, because it just absolutely doesn't.
Let me ask 2 questions. So first off, like, what was the first one? Oh yeah, so yes, there is a triangle. How do we feel about a lot of that? There being so many different types of control decks. First question. Second question being, how do we feel, like, how relevant is quick solvability in a meta, and does this quick solvability or quick stasis point, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because it seems like we came to a quick stasis point very quickly. I'll give both those questions to Adam first.
All right, so I'm glad you brought up the fact that there are a lot of different control decks, because there are, but not really. There are 3 different control decks. There's a Shadow Isles control deck, there's a Piltover and Zaun control deck, and there's an Ionia control deck. And you can mix and match those, but fundamentally you're playing one of those 3 decks. What there are not are any other control decks, or for that matter, any other aggro or mid-range decks. Burn aggro is the only really viable aggro deck. Bannerman's the only viable mid-range deck, and it doesn't matter what flavor of control you're playing 2 of the 3 regions that I just mentioned. What that leaves lacking is other options, other things you can play. So you can't play anything in the Freljord. You can't play Bilgewater really to much success, though I've seen it occasionally as the second option in your control deck. Noxus's cards that are not in Burn Aggro are completely unplayed. What's the region I've completely forgotten? No, okay, that's all 7 regions accounted for. Oh
Yeah,
yes, that's right.
yeah.
Demacian cards that are not in Bannerman or exactly Lux and Unbreakable Will or whatever it's called.
Let me pass off to Stan and also add on. So the same 2 questions, Stan, like kind of respond to Adam, but also in particular, I would like you to focus on the Freljord issue, right? Because I think that is probably something that could be touched on. Is like it's very underrepresented in the meta, at least from what I'm seeing on the tier list. So what do you respond to those questions with?
Yeah, I would say that it is a shame right now that Freljord is probably the most unbalanced thing in this game, just in that Freljord doesn't have a great representation in the meta, and there's not much to do with it. I think it's just because they gave Freljord very limited tools, and they're kind of just really in like rogue deck status right now. So that is probably the biggest downside of the meta right now, but that's something where they can maybe buff some cards to make Freljord more relevant again. I mean,
so you're saying it's more of a like tweak at the edges than it is like a glaring fault.
Yeah, I think just Freljord probably needs a bit more to make their stuff really stick. Probably just giving them a bit more, even though it cut into Demacia's identity a little bit, give Freljord cards a bit more toughness just to kind of keep them in the fight a bit longer would probably be, a simple thing to push Freljord back into, a bit more viability. Because they have a lot of good cards with good effects. They just... They kind of get beat out by some of the other strategies right now. And I mean, more importantly, I think just with Freljordian cards, what you end up with is there are hands and situations where your deck is very powerful, but probably just at the level of everything else, where they kind of just need to get a little push past that to where their great hands are truly great and, actually something to be feared and not just putting you on, the same playing field as everybody else.
If I might, Stan, you said Freljord doesn't have great tools, but Freljord has as some of its core identities AoE and a decent amount of healing, as well as units, and it does have units with high health. Right? These are the kind of tools that in the metagame driven by Burn Aggro should be good, but aren't. It's not that Freljord doesn't have the tools, it's that their tools are just not as strong as the other regions. It's bad balance.
Yeah.
Well, so that actually brings up another question here that's kind of related then, right? So have their card changes or have Riot's changes in these patches, have they been effective? I mean, you're basically arguing on the same lines here, but I'll go ahead and point this one to Stan. How do you feel their card changes have been? Do you in general good? Yeah.
Yeah. In general.
What are some of the good highlights from those changes?
Yeah, I think in general the changes have been good. I mean. Getting us out of a state where Hecarim is too good, giving us out of a state where elusives are too good. I think more than anything, just the addition of Bilgewater has done so much to really the new cards added to the game are honestly the bigger balance changes than almost any of the patches they put in before, or in conjunction with them especially. Have led to a state where I don't know what the next thing they really need to buff or nerf is really. I think right now buffs are needed more than nerfs. Again, specifically for things like Freljord, they need to find a way to make Freljord a bit more viable. But the other regions are all doing a really good job competing with each other. They're all pretty close. They have tools that work. They have tools for your janky decks. They have tools for your competitive decks. And they've gotten to a point where they all feel like they're running at about the same power level. Again, your Noxian Bird cards are good enough to compete with your Shadow Isles control stuff. You know, your Demacian mid-range, well, just by value of being mid-range, plays that perfectly, where, you know, it'll beat up on aggro decks, beat up on anything smaller than it, and, you know, have a tough time with control, but there's still good enough cards that they can win in the right circumstances. So nothing feels too out of place there. Everything got kind of put where it needed to be. Like, making Bannerman less powerful so it buffs one less thing on the board, that helped a ton. Old nerfs to things like, again, Kinko Elusives I think was one of the big ones, nerfing that deck into a balanced spot, and now, I mean, to the point where with the new set, Elusives are kind of where I think they wanted them to be in the first place, where you splash Elusives into some decks as, you know, ways to poke, but it's not the all-in strategy anymore. Like, there's a little bit of it here and there, but Elusives are kind of rogue decks now. God, did have to go back and
how do you, Adam, how do you counter about the card changes? And I guess in particular, I'll just go ahead and say Black Spear or whatever.
Yeah, well, Dan knows where I'm headed with this, but I'm going to take a bit of a walk to get there.
That's one nerf, though. One nerf.
I was trying to get you on a fucking sprint to it, but okay, that's fine.
So the card changes have had some good effects, right? I think it was right to nerf Elusives, though it took them a while getting there. I think it was right to nerf the Fearsome deck, though I think that they overdid some of that. My fundamental problem is that when they nerf stuff, they tend to attack decks rather than attacking cards. So when they take a deck, they say, what's the best deck in the metagame? All right, well, this, you know, in this case it will be burn aggro, but in some other case it will be, you know, in days past it was Fearsome or Elusives. And their response to that was, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this deck and we're just going to pick a card that's played and nerf it. And they didn't really target the cards to the core problems. You know, cards that have been nerfed that did not need to be nerfed include Ledros, who sees a bit of play still because he's a good enough card anyways, and in the decks he sees play, you don't care about the cost. Raza, who sees absolutely no play now. Right. I mean, I'm still playing it, but that's because I love the card, not because I think it's the right choice. Black Spear, which sees no play, outside of the occasional flipped Callista, and which already this game has a problem with removal and threats, which I'll get to in a moment. But fundamentally, the nerfing a removal spell that already had some conditions on it was not a great place for the game to be. I mean, I could continue down the list, but yeah, I've chosen three that I think are most emblematic, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
These are cards that derive much of their strength from the way in which they interact with the opponent. I mean, Ledros as a finisher, you need to interact to make him good. He's not strong because he interacts, he's strong because you already interacted, but still, the same principle applies. So, taking this back a bit, Riot's nerf strategy has been attack good cards without consideration for the way in which they push the meta. Part of the reason Kinko Elusives was so good for so long is that when they nerfed the other deck in the metagame, they nerfed its interactive tools, right? Fearsome didn't lose damage until the Hecarim nerf set.
Right.
And, you know, once it did, that finally took it off the map, and when they nerfed Kinko Elusives, they nerfed it so that it's hard for it to do damage by nerfing its health, which is ironic, but it works the same way. The point being that when they finally got around to nerfing Kinko Elusives the right way, they didn't go back and fix the interactive issues. So what they've done is their nerf strategy has been effective at stopping the top deck from being the top deck forever, but it has not been effective at encouraging interaction, right? What are the two best decks right now? They're the I don't care what you're doing, I'm going to do damage to your face deck, and they're the I'm just going to put the biggest bodies on the board and watch you struggle to deal with that deck. You know, this isn't I mean, yes, creature combat requires some thought. I'm not trying to say Bannerman is a mindless deck. It's not. You know, you have to play it with some strategy and some interaction. But fundamentally, what Bannerman is trying to do is compare its numbers with your numbers and find out that its are bigger. And in general, that's the result of a nerf strategy that moves us towards more aggressively the notion of stopping creatures on board being a challenge, right? If removal gets weakened, then numbers on board are more valuable, and therefore the thing with the biggest numbers are going to win, and that's Bannerman. Additionally, if removal gets lessened, then it's easier to do damage directly with cheap creatures, which again makes burn the other viable option. I mean, yes, the control decks exist. I'm not trying to say that they're not viable, but these control decks run heavy creature packages, right? You mentioned how Lux Karma looks like a mid-range deck. That's because it kind of is, because, again, numbers on board matter. You're not really playing a control deck for half the game. Karina Control runs the Spider package and Elise because, again, numbers on board matter, right? The Runeterra nerfs have had a very targeted effect, and it's to make creatures on board matter more. But that's a big reason why certain regions can't compete except in very specific ways or at all, right? If you aren't a region that either can put something very efficient on board early or can handle those types of boards, you're not going to succeed. There's some fairly decent AoE in Freljord, but it's all low to the ground AoE. It's avalanche and things like that. If your opponent's putting, if your opponent is saying, I'm going to put large creatures on board, then avalanche isn't going to do much. And Freljord's own creatures can't compete on raw numbers because that's Demasia's shtick. So Freljord is left with an ineffective thing. It's the fault of Riot's removal balance policy that has made Freljord weak, right? And yes, they can go back and buff, but the thing they need to buff, and it's not the thing they will buff if history has gone by, is interaction, right? If Avalanche did 3 damage, we'd be looking at a very different world.
Sure.
I do think that the game has set itself up in such a way that even with some of the nerfs to things like Ledros and stuff like that, putting them a little later into the game, a lot of these control decks have good enough combo finishing pieces that they're not necessarily even fighting for the board, they're just fighting for time. So, yes, your interaction isn't that great, but you're not supposed to be necessarily killing their units at all times, just keeping them at bay, making sure that you're using your small creatures to trade for the important ones. What Riot has basically said here is that your straight damage removal and stuff like that isn't as good as it is in games like Magic and things like that. So instead, you need to figure out how to use small creatures and things that are slightly less efficient than what your opponent has on the board to get to your late game plan if you're playing control.
And I get that, and I agree with it. And creature combat is engaging. That's it's not a fundamentally bad thing. But the issue is, it means that that the regions which rely on anything other than creature size or having Elise are shit out of luck.
Yeah.
Sure, but I think that's another place that even if they don't historically, change things for Freljord to just give their spells a bit more power, which I think would be a decent way to get them back into the meta and probably a pretty balanced way to do it as well. They could also give them maybe some better inevitability. They have decent ways of, buffing things throughout their deck, but maybe making more things like Omen Hawk and Babbling Bjerg that let you kind of generate value as you're going through. And even if it's not as efficient as the Demasian creature, it's giving you more total card advantage than they have to keep going.
But Stan, inevitability is also doomed in this game, in no small part because of cards like Ledros from Shadow Isles, but also cards like, what is that freaking 8-mana spell in Demacia?
The Unyielding Spirit.
Yes, Unyielding Spirit has utterly crushed any potential for inevitability. Furthermore, Unyielding Spirit is the poster child for threats versus interaction. Unyielding Spirit is an 8-mana burst spell that doesn't undo the effect of Vengeance, a 7-mana fast spell. It undoes the effect of every Vengeance for the rest of the game.
Right, and I do think that is a card that might need to get looked at, that in its own right kind of leads to some awkward gameplay moments, but it's still by no means unbeatable. It doesn't stop
it's not
here.
unbeatable, but we're not talking about whether or not the card is playable or balanced. We're talking about the specific balance of threats versus answers. The way you beat Unyielding Spirit is by killing your opponent.
Or Will of Ione, but it does pigeonhole you into certain strategies.
Right.
In theory, if that becomes the dominant card.
Right. Which, yeah, I think there's
Which
only
is
that
Adam's point,
Nautilus and, like, one other thing that handles that, you know, around its conditions.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, or specifically around Unyielding Spirit, is that it's very emblematic of the. I think 8 is probably an acceptable time in the game for that type of effect to come down. It's similar to Ledros. It's similar to all sorts of other finishers.
It's also not.
But what it's not similar to
it's...
is the tools to answer things like that, right? If that card can exist at 8, but Vengeance should be 6 or even 5.
Okay. To come down just a bit earlier, come down. I mean, maybe even make it not burst speed so it can be responded to would be another, like...
yeah, that's another option I'd appreciate, right? If that effect is going to exist, make it so that you can respond to it. So if you are a deck that tries to use your removal effectively, you aren't just blown out if you have to use a kill spell at one time.
Right. And again, I agree that there are certain cards that still need to be looked at and changed and update, but especially going back to that, you know, if we're talking about cards versus decks being nerfed, I think the only, like, real bad examples of them nerfing a deck are Black Spear. That's still one that I don't get, but doing things like nerfing Hecarim ended up being good, not just for nerfing a good card, but it actually kind of, for the time that they did it, streamlined him into the deck they wanted him to be in. They still made him powerful, but they made him powerful in a different way. And that's another thing that I think they've done very well with their nerfs versus balances, is when a card is too powerful, they don't just kill the card, they try and rework it so that it can be used in a different strategy. It's what they've done with Callista for, like, buffing Callista, or, you know, just changing fundamentally how she works until she fits in a home that's hers and has viability. I think they've done that well with plenty of cards. And kind of all of their nerfs have, to some extent, been geared at the card. Like, while Bannerman is a Bannerman deck, that's kind of the thing with all the Allegiance cards they had to look at was, you know, yes, that's going to hurt specifically that deck more than anything because of how the Allegiance deck building mechanic works, but it's still really only targeting that card. And I really only stand by, like, Black Spear is the only time that they overdid it and reached into a deck instead of a card itself. I still don't know what the Black Spear thing's about. That's weird.
I mean, Deny is the other card that comes to mind in that sense.
Right. But Deny was a very early on thing, and I think at this point we've, hit a point where Deny at 4 mana seems right. Like, Deny...
I think Deny could survive at 3 mana if you were willing to balance other cards around it. I think that it's okay to put Deny at 4 mana and call it a day, but I think that it is not the optimal choice. It's a half measure.
Okay.
How about let's go ahead and start moving on. But I think maybe one place we can come to agreement is that the meta feels at least acceptable or healthy enough if you are exclusively interested in looking for an archetype that is represented. You can find an archetype representation. However, if you are focused on a particular region, particularly Freljord or a particular, like, you know, swath of champions, you might not be able to ladder up to, you know, diamond or platinum or master with that that, you know, pet deck.
Yeah, so that's a fair assessment. You know, there are things there are options for every strategy, but not for every card.
Yeah, exactly. Right. All right, let's move on to the next one. And Stan, you can go ahead and take over. I'll pass my moderator's hat to you and my moderator's belt in case we get out of line.
Oh yes, thank you.
Whip us.
Yes,
but let's go ahead and check out this next one.
Oh shit. Google Doc.
I'll go ahead and do this last bit of duty. So the statement we have here is Riot is not just overlooking the Expeditions meta or is just focusing on the ladder meta. So Adam will be arguing that they are not overlooking Expeditions. I will be arguing that they in fact are. So Adam, you can go ahead and go first because I'm just going to go ahead because that's me. I want to get the rebuttal.
All right. Let's start with the just obvious, raw, objective evidence. Every time there are patch notes, there are Expedition-focused patch notes. They change card pools. They've even changed cards for the purposes of Expedition. Expedition is a game mode where they are clearly paying attention, they spend time on it, they put work in, and if you play Expedition, the results show. You get to draft a variety of different decks, and the games play out interestingly and engagingly.
Is that your full? Okay, fantastic.
Don't
I'm
need
glad
much.
that you.
Expedition is in a good spot.
What is
I'm
it
glad
now?
you brought up the raw data because I think the raw data is exactly where we want to be talking about as someone who's arguing against this. So I actually combed through the data as I was pretending to do moderating duties. Sorry, but I was over here inspecting for my future debate, and I saw only about 6 to 7 card changes in Expeditions. And that could be off by a little bit because I'm not saying I got every single one, but probably less than a dozen card changes exclusively targeted at Expeditions, whereas there's been double, triple that for the ladder meta. I mean, that just on a raw numbers says they're not. Second off, I would argue that, and again, this is mildly anecdotal, I understand that, okay, but all of my games of Expeditions, while I like the system that they have in place of like lose 2, you're out or whatever, it almost exclusively goes 7-0 or 0-7, which to me indicates
0-2.
that there's some 7-0 or 0-2. To me, indicating there's some difference in archetypes, or I'll try a different archetype. It's just not as good as these mid-range slugfests that I start getting into. I can't get a good synergy-based Expedition, and there's clearly something going on there that they're not focusing on. Third off, I would like to point out that they have moved the Expedition reward system, particularly the very good one of was it like a champion. They moved that outside of the Expedition track into just your weekly vault, meaning you don't even have to touch Expedition anymore if you don't want to. Which to me indicates that they've seen data that maybe people don't even want to play Expeditions. They're just like, screw it. I don't like it because it sucks. That's what I'm saying.
That's a rebuttal right there.
All right.
And he's speechless, damn it.
That data doesn't care about your feelings, Adam. You're going to have to...
All right. Okay, Dan had 3 key points. I'll start with the first, which is there are more changes for Constructed than Expeditions. I have 2 points here. The first is simple. Of course, there are more changes for Constructed than Expeditions. Constructed is a finely tuned machine. Small changes can make big differences.
Yeah!
Fair. Yeah. I will. That's fair. I will actually.
But secondly, and this is also important, if something is unbalanced in Constructed, it's likely unbalanced in Expedition, or it could be, and changing it could be a net benefit to Expedition. I know, for example, the Raza and Ledros changes were huge. I mean, those cards are insane in Expedition. Any nerf to them was appropriate, if we were talking just about Expedition. Which I know I just trashed those for Constructed, but for Expeditions, those nerfs were great. Additionally, Expedition changes do not have to only be called Expedition changes, is the kind of TLDR of that one.
Okay, I will. Okay, so yeah, sorry.
All right, so to your second point.
I'll just go and write that one down.
All right, so all right. Sorry, to your third point, I'll circle back to your second point.
Sure. That's fine.
To your third point, which is that your Expeditions tend to be 7-0s or 0-2s, have you considered, Dan, that maybe that's just a factor of your skill?
I was going to say that I suck. I mean, well, no,
Yeah.
right? Because there's a level of consistency with me being the one that's playing, right? So if I'm...
That's fair, right?
I mean, also just the point of, like, I've played, I mean, you know me, like, you know my history. I guess the listeners don't, but, like, I mean, I've played every single deck archetype under the sun under multiple card games. Like,
Yeah,
I don't think it's an
really
issue.
has.
Yeah.
So that's fair, right? You're an adaptive player, but it is possible, right, that there are decks you play better or worse, not that you just play more or less.
No, that's fair, yeah.
Right? Maybe your brain works just the right way for that all-in Spiders deck, but when it's kind of the Heimerdinger you need to stall deck, that's just not how your brain does things.
The reason I disagree with that is that I almost exclusively play control decks in ladder. And
So-
I almost
Alright,
exclusively
well,
try to
then
get
I have them
expedition decks and
flipped.
which is actually kind of to my like. I'll just go ahead and cut into my two rebuttals to your rebuttals.
Go
and that
ahead.
is,
My rebuttal to your number 2 is not important.
what's that?
Yes, go. I'm
Okay,
done.
sure. Okay, you're trying to meme on me. Yeah, so the 2 points I would say is that I feel like whenever I 7-0, it's almost exclusively aggro decks. Because it's just like I'm just like slamming as much stuff into people's face as I can as quickly as possible just to get it done with. I guess that's partially because I'm just like I don't even want to be here right now. But also, I feel like anytime I'm going O2, it's like I'm trying to like go through pretty strongly with one of the archetypes that they've set up early with the champion. So like I feel like I'll like do the Callista dying deck and I'll like pick some of the ones to make sure I get all the synergies, and it just falls apart. Which makes me wonder if they need to start tuning how you select cards. And then the second point I will make is that while yes, those changes for ladder do definitely help in expedition, like you're absolutely right on Rasa. I know that for a fact because I would go into early expeditions and almost exclusively try to get Shadow Isles so I could hit Rasa.
I had a deck with 4/7 cost
Yeah.
Rasas. It was beautiful.
Exactly. While that's true, the changes that they do make to expeditions, it's like they're only touching those little baby cards. Like they will never ever change a champion for expeditions. They will never change one of their flagship cards just for expeditions, and I can like guarantee that. And I feel like everyone kind of knows that. Like everyone just kind of inherently kind of feels that that's correct, and that's why I'm saying like they're overlooking it because they're like this is kind of just off to the side. And like if you like this format, that's great, but like we don't really like. We know where the money is. We know where it matters, and that's the ladder. That's the pro players. That's the Twitch streamers.
All right. I see your points, but now I think it's time for me to finally rebut the second point you made the first time around,
Yeah,
which
go
is
for
that they've moved rewards out of expeditions.
Yeah.
I think you'd be right that would be evidence of overlooking expeditions if you thought that expeditions were played mostly for the rewards. If, on the other hand, you think people play expeditions because they like expeditions, then by moving rewards out, you remove the incentive for bad players to play expeditions, and you get better games.
Okay,
Right.
that's a fair point. Yep,
If
absolutely.
the only people grinding expeditions are the people who really enjoy it, then after the first 2 wins especially, your pool of people you're playing against in expeditions are going to be skilled, thoughtful expedition players.
Yeah, that's
and by
actually a very good
reducing
point.
the incentive for other players to grind expeditions, you increase the average quality of game. So by reducing the rewards, they have actually increased the quality in expeditions.
Honestly, I'm not even gonna try to rebut that. I think that's actually just correct. Like that's actually just correct. And I think we've reached a pretty good consensus point here. Honestly, like I think we can both agree they're probably not going to change a champion ever for expeditions, which
Yeah,
does
I can't fight that.
kind of makes me sad. But at the same time, I do think in general, like, yeah, you're gonna find higher quality players here because they are just here for the expeditions.
I
which
mean,
is
have you
good
ever
enough.
made the mistake of drafting a Maokai in expeditions?
I have not.
You straight can't flip him. I mean, it's mathematically possible to flip him. There are enough token
Yeah.
generators in the game, but practically you can't flip him.
I mean, yeah. To me, the big expeditions problem is like sometimes you'll be like halfway. You'll have your payload or your engine piece of whatever synergistic thing you're doing, and then the other part just never comes, and you're just like, okay, I lose. Like to me, that's the biggest problem, and that's why I wish we could move to some sort of maybe less clump-based selection. Although I like the novelty of it at the start, I would like a little more granularity with how I pick cards. Or some level of being able to say, hey, I'd like to trade this card in particular, and then just kind of give me one of these 3 random cards or something.
So
You
In
know.
my experience, the clumps are good because it makes the decisions more rich and challenging, right?
Sure.
If I was taking one card at a time, I would just always have the right number of vengeances in my deck.
That's fair. Yeah,
Whereas
that's fair.
if I have to take clumps, I have to decide whether vengeance plus 2 unplayable cards is worth taking.
Yeah, I would like to have some level of clumping and some level of like more like my trading. Then I think I'd like my trading to be a little, just
Yeah,
a
I'm with
tad
you
more
on
granular.
that. Just like something you can allowing you to nudge your deck a bit more specifically.
So what if
And
they
of
did
course,
something
what we all really want is just Magic drafting, but that's hard to
Yeah.
do if you're not Magic the
Yeah.
Gathering.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what if they did something completely crazy though, and had expedition-specific versions of cards?
Yeah,
They
I was
do
thinking about
that,
this as I was arguing actually.
Um, the Pursuit of Perfection is not the same in Expeditions as it is in normal decks.
Really?
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. It should be like what, like 10, 15 cards?
I think it's 15, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah.
Interesting.
15 sounds right.
So there is history of them doing this already then.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it wouldn't be infeasible. My issue with that would be if they do it too much and you're switching between both modes, it's a nightmare. Like especially if they start
absolutely.
doing it with champions.
Yep.
Like but yeah, anyways, let's go ahead and step into the next. We're getting into the tournament portion of our debate. So we're going to talk about conquest here. Stan will be for and Adam will be against on the question or the statement of conquest is a good tournament mode. So I'm actually going to let Stan go first here since Adam went first the last 2 times.
Yeah, good call.
So yeah, Conquest is a very solid tournament mode for getting a best 2 out of 3 game handled, and I think it allows you to show a very deep understanding of the meta where it's not just playing 3 of the best decks, but specifically knowing how to beat decks and what's going to be there. I think that it may have some flaws for its overall gameplay per game, but it does show a very high level understanding of the game as a whole, because you're making decisions before the game even starts about how you're going to attack the metagame. The fact that most of what you do is find the right deck to attack, understand what people are going to bring, and make sure you build your lineup so that you're going to guarantee that win. It also leads to, I think, deck building that's really interesting, where people have to try and make their decks as resilient as possible, because they don't want to just lose if they don't hit the deck that they need to beat. So if you go all in on that strategy and you happen to call the meta wrong, you're screwed if you go too far in on it. So you do really have to strike a good balance of knowing what's going to show up, knowing what the top thing to beat is, and understanding how your decks and your lineup is going to beat the things under it. It also, especially in this mode, where you can sort of ban out a whole region, lets you play crazier strategies, because you can do things like ban out Ionia and know that you can put your opponent in a spot where they have to answer your big spells, but they don't have deny anymore. And your opponents have to think about that of like, well, how does this deck handle this? How does, everything work out in the end? And I think it shows a deep level of understanding in the best 2 out of 3 format, and then still has good games, even if they're not as good as 2 people just bringing their best decks to the table and playing 2 out of 3 with that.
Adam, go for it.
So I'd like to start with a rebuttal to Stan. I think that Conquest doesn't foster diversity. Conquest observes a large amount of artificial diversity, but when you really drill down to it, most Conquest decks start to look the same, right? When we were looking through the lists from Twitch Rivals, we were surprised by 3 lists out of 3 lists times 8 competitors is 24.
I think that's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of those surprises was a truly innovative list from Mogwai, and some of those, and the other surprises were just slight variations on stuff we'd seen. What Conquest tends to do, and I've watched a lot of this from Hearthstone, is you end up with a single best deck driving the metagame, and then reactions to that deck, and that's it. And it tends to be fairly small. Additionally, because that deck can be banned out or can be targeted, what you don't see are people kind of hinging their success on beating that deck or on adapting to that deck, right? No one I think it would be fair to say that Twitch Rivals, the best deck, was one of the two control lists driving the metagame, either Karina Control or one of the Karma control decks, probably Karma Lux at the time, maybe Karma Ezreal. The point being that all of these lists, every list was one of those decks, or built to beat that deck, and it was not something innovative or fascinating built to beat that deck. It was just, here's a consistent list that I know beats it, because you didn't need to be creative, because people were never going to adapt that deck to beat your deck and kind of have this escalating arms race that creates interesting metagames, because they knew that if they saw something they couldn't beat, they just ban it. So rather than being incentivized to innovate and come up with something truly creative, credit to Mogwai for doing it anyways, you are incentivized to play good, stable lists and just try to metagame them around each other. On the other hand, single deck tournaments, because so much of your success hinges on something the single deck, you're incentivized to put a lot more effort into that deck and into ways of varying that deck and of finding new decks, right? If you come up with something that no one knows is coming, that no one is expecting in a conquest event, it gets banned and you go about your day. If, on the other hand, you come up with something no one is expecting on a single deck tournament, then you're just going to run through unexpected people. Yeah, you'll still have a metagame around you, right? You'll still have to beat certain decks and lose to certain decks. But the element of surprise is much more valuable when there's no escaping it. Additionally, and this is important, single deck tournaments often have the ability to have more flexible options around that single deck, right? We've talked about Magic-style sideboarding events, and sideboarding events are good because suddenly your deck is, while you have your deck core and the time you've put in on that deck maintains its value, you get to do things like see how the deck plays in a bad matchup played well, right? In Conquest, you rarely see bad matchups because between bans, deck selection, and all sorts of other things, you're going to see the most boring centralized matchups every time, because why would you ever risk anything else? In single deck tournaments, you don't really have an option. If you have a bad matchup, you have a bad matchup, and you have to show that you know how to play your bad matchups and win your bad matchups if you want to keep going. Lastly, and this is important, Conquest, despite attempting to enforce some amount of class diversity, actually tends to showcase the ways in which diversity is least prevalent by these kind of mandated deck combinations that you use in Conquest because you can't overlap, means that you are stuck playing the strong combinations, right? So you had to pair your Piltover and Zaun in this Conquest, in the Twitch Rivals format, with either Shadow Isles for Karina control or with Ionia for Hermes or something similar. Now, this isn't an inherent flaw of Conquest, but the vast majority of Conquest events do tend to have these very strict separations and strict rules on what you bring, and it tends to basically leave you playing the same combinations because you have such a restricted space, right? When you have to bring 6 of the 7 regions, and you have to bring them in combinations of 2 and you can't overlap, there are only so many ways to solve that equation. Yeah, it's why when we saw Freljord decks, we saw, other than, again, Mogwai's very innovative list, and credit to that list, we saw a single Freljord card in our Demacia Bannerman deck.
But we did also discuss, in general, Freljord's a bit weaker. But, it was the best splash option.
There's nothing you can get. There's nothing you can get out of Freljord in that type of event. If you... So, for example, if you say you thought, and I understand this particular example is kind of silly, but say you thought there was a particular matchup like Karina Control that Vlad Braum was good in.
Sure.
Now, I don't think that exact answer is exactly accurate, but we're going to use that as an example to illustrate a point, which is that if you thought that matchup was good for Vlad Braum, and you thought that you could tech your sideboard to beat Burn or whatever, whatever the aggressive deck would be in the metagame in a single deck event, then that's a kind of deck you could build, you could bring as a way of catching people off guard. That ties back into my point about surprise, right? You get you get opportunities to do things you would never be able to do in a conquest tournament.
Right.
At this point, I've kind of run on, so I'm going to let you have the rebuttal here.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that it would be great to sideboard, but in a game like Runeterra, where we don't know how sideboarding would even work, Conquest is really the best we have for giving us 3 different options for, having different decks play out. And I think in Runeterra, the actual changes to things, like, the games that I saw were by no means stale or boring. They managed to stay in a really solid spot, and they were all really exciting to watch.
Gameplay is different from the metagame. I agree that the gameplay from the event was actually pretty good.
Yeah, and I think that when you're saying that, what you end up getting is a lot more of the best decks playing against each other, not bad matchups, but those to me are the more exciting games, because your bad matchup you either have to kind of fight through and win, and those are great to watch, but on average, you're going to have a much better time when the decks are fairly evenly matched. So I just feel like those games end up being not stale, but a lot more fun. But that's really all I got on that. I think we're hitting time for the next section.
Absolutely. All right.
So I guess I'm moderating this next section.
Sounds good.
So Stan, the question posed to you is strategic roping acceptable? Dan, you're the 4, so start us off.
Absolutely. Let's return back to 1964. A little quote from a good friend of mine known as Malcolm X, who said, "By any means necessary." Now, he said a bunch of words before that. I can't really find them right now, and I think they're actually probably rather politically and racially motivated, which, I'm not going to get into right now because this is in fact a digital card game podcast, not a podcast about politics. But anyways, strategic roping, is it acceptable? Absolutely, by any means necessary. If you have a confines of rules in which to act upon, you are perfectly within your right to use those to advance your means by any means necessary. I would need to understand really how you could say it wasn't. I mean, these are pro players. Like their entire job is to stream for people, make good content, make fun. Like this is the time that they're supposed to be putting into the game. That's it. I mean, they've got time to play this game. If you have time to play this game, you have time to rope and compete. Like it's an interesting extra element to make a game around, in my opinion.
So,
all right, Stan, we've got some deep history cited there. You have a rebuttal?
Yeah, absolutely, I did.
So I am very against strategic roping, but more I'm against events that kind of allow strategic roping to be a valid way to win the game. I just think that it's kind of bad form that you can essentially force a tie just by waiting and using the game's mechanics against people. Especially in the sense that, like, how do you determine if it was excessive or not? The game gave you a time clock, and that's supposed to be what's determined fair, but when in events, using that fair time clock can make it impossible for your opponent who is ahead in the game or, potentially going to get the win, they can't get the win anymore because you're able to just run the clock out on them. I think that a much stricter form of roping needs to be in place where, like, if you rope, you're roping yourself. If it's a timed event, that's counting against you, not the other player. Because it's not a fair way for someone to have to play the game where they have to now move fast to keep up with your clock that you're running out. It's just a complete unfair advantage to basically put double pressure on someone to not have a game end in a tie and potentially, cost them, as we've seen in like the Twitch Rivals tournament, a seat in the top 8 just because you took longer than they did. That just doesn't seem fair in any way, shape, or form.
All right,
so
Dan,
would
you like to rebut that?
Always. Absolutely. So I will say this. This is kind of to one point you made. pro players have other jobs, right? They've got time constraints, like we all do. There needs to be rules in place that they might exist outside of the actual game client itself. I mean, that's how Conquest works, or like, you know, that type of thing. Like there will be rules outside of it to make interesting gameplay, just to make the trains run on time, so to speak. And as long as there are rules that are like enforced, or that are made, that are outside of some, you know, automated force, there will be even if they do have an automated force, there will be ways to exploit them or to use them to your advantage. And as long as everybody is fully aware, and as long as those rules are abided by, anybody can participate in doing this roping, or doing any of these sort of things. So really, it's more about not using an extra dimension. It's about to take this away from people just through like social outcry or whatever, is to take away another dimension of complexity in competition. That I think is very sad to see from a social Darwinist perspective. Just kidding on that last part.
Yeah.
Wow, citing both Malcolm X and social Darwinism in the same
I know,
argument.
right?
That's some
Where does this guy
ambitious
stand?
arguing there, Dan.
Where does this guy stand?
I still think that the big problem here is that what you're getting at is that it's a tool that's available to both players, but it is a tool that is leveraged in a way that's not fair to both players. The player who is roping, the moment they decide to start doing that, is inherently gaining such a huge advantage, because if they're in a position where they can tie and you cannot, then there's some underlying issue that, yes, it's part of the rules, but that is the underlying issue. That shouldn't be a situation that they have that advantage for. That you have to be so far ahead in a tournament that you can afford someone roping you to a tie because they don't need the win. And a loss would hurt them. That just can't be a fair way for players to progress through a tournament structure. Like, that's completely incentivizing to people who are already ahead. There's no reason for them to not rope, essentially. Maybe offering something like, you know, offering a buy would be fine or something like that, but not to the point where it's detrimental to other players and their tournament standings. That's where this becomes a problem. And, I mean, it's something that you are allowed under the rules to do, but that's what the part that needs to change, is the rules need to adjust in such a way that that's not what they're allowed to do. And I think that it is immoral to do it, even if it is technically correct within the rules. And I mean, the other problem is that in what situations are you truly gaining something by getting that? Unless you're kicking out someone that you know you specifically have a bad matchup against, why are you doing that to someone?
Again, that's competition, baby. That's competition. I mean, like, to me, so to me, like, that is fine to say. It's like, you can certainly say it's unacceptable or immoral. That is immoral, I take issue with, because like inherently, anytime you try to like scribe morality onto a rule-based system, you're going to have issues. But if you have an alternative to strategic roping, then definitely offer that. But as far as I can tell right now, this is the best we have. So rather than like just say you can't do this, give us an alternate reality to live in, or an alternate system. Because to me, if I can't see a system worth taking otherwise, then this is the best we have, right?
Best, yeah.
All right, Dan's giving you an out. Where's the alternate system? Show us.
It's an out, but also a
system
logical
that works.
fallacy.
I mean, it's chess timers. Chess timers is the way to go. Give me
Chess
my
timers,
chess
Dan?
timers.
So
Is
chess
that
timers.
enough for you?
I don't. Let's see. So it's like you each get 50 minutes, and then you run it out based off how much you're spending the time on.
Yeah.
I think it's. I would have to think about it a little bit. I figured you're going to get a chess timers, and I can't think of any good argument against it right now. I've tried to stall really hard, and I can't.
So it's time to move on to memes.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Good work, guys. I think that we've come to a place we like with chess timers.
Yeah,
Yes.
I was trying really hard to think of some way to counter that, and there probably is some way. Like you still are going to be roping in that or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's
All
still
right.
it hurts you. All right, let's do it.
So it's time for us to move on to
Memes,
higher realm of debate,
Yes.
namely the meme
Fourth
debate.
order. Fourth order debate. Yeah.
Indeed.
Let's do these as
So-
flash rounds, maybe.
What's that?
Flash round indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Flash memes.
Yasuo, meme, not a meme.
Not a meme. Yasuo was a
All right.
real boy. Very real boy. He has all the stats now. He has all the power now. He might not be on the tier list, but that doesn't make him not a meme. That just makes him a sleeper. He's fighting through. He's
Dan?
gonna do it. He's got it.
The very fact that he is in the meme section makes him a goddamn meme. The fact that we even have to consider it, have to talk about him here, means he is. Next question.
Dan has just smoked you, Stan. All right. Okay, next question. Bannerman, should it just buff Poros?
Yes, and it should double buff Poros.
Dan?
No, the only way it should buff Poros is there should be a separate Poros Bannerman that buffs Poros. We should keep them separate but equal. Jesus Christ! Make it off.
No, Dan.
Wow,
not
Dan, you
Anyways, next question.
that is some real impressive mental gymnastics, Dan. Next question. Bannerman, do they need buffs?
Yes, and like I said, we need both Bannermen. We need Bannerman OG to not only buff your current cards that are out, but also every card in your deck
Oh, Jesus.
and all of your creatures every time you play after using it. There's
Okay.
sort of a meta game
Okay.
going on. with
Gotcha.
that.
I think Bannerman needs to stop buffing. He should just be a 4-mana 3/3, and he'd be a much better card.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Okay.
All right, final question. Poros, are they the only tribe we should be allowed to play?
Adam is against this, I see in the notes here, and I'm just going to go ahead and say that if you haven't listened to the rest of the debates, Adam is clearly wrong about this. Then just by
Yeah, this
virtue
is
of being
actually
Adam.
just the question where we attack Adam's moral fiber.
Yeah,
Adam
so-
is wrong. He's a Dumbo pants.
Poros are the only region you should play. They're adorable. They have all of the keywords, and did I say they're
Yeah.
adorable already? Because I feel
How
I
do you
should say
how
that,
do you
like-
beat Plunder Poro, Adam? How do you argue against the
Yeah.
sweet little bearded boy?
I have an answer for you, but it's real good. So you see, what happens if we only play Poros is that everyone else is also playing Poros, and when everyone is Poros, no
Oh,
one is more
snap.
cute than anyone else.
Oh snap!
In
That's
order
a really good
for
argument.
Poros to be what they are, you have to have something else that they can be cuter than.
Wow.
We must have villains for there to be heroes.
Okay.
This is a very
No,
existential
But
Mono-
argument.
I've got a really
World.
easy answer to this. They give you skins for your Poro cards, so that you can have cuter Poros than the other Poros.
This is a very existential argument. I switch sides now. I am with Adam on. being against.
No.
Yeah, sorry. He's
You're
actually
outnumbered,
100%
Stan.
right on that one.
Don't.
All right. Well, that has been our debate round, our debate pod, our debate epi. It felt very West Wing in here today. But anyways, we hope you guys enjoyed that. And for Runeterra, I've been Grandmaster Dan,
I've been Adam Edelman Munoz.
And I'm Stan Jerzewski.
and we'll still be those people next time, and we'll see you then.
And by the rule of voting, I'm the best.